What's up, guys, and welcome back to Moan Inc. If you guys are new here, then hello. My name is Erica, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you joining me today on the channel. Now, if you guys are regulars here, you will know, you will be aware that my comment section has been flooded with Gilgamesh requests. And I don't mean that lightly, right? If you go to every single one of my Iliad videos, somebody is asking me to do Gilgamesh next, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, every single summary series I have done, you guys have been begging for Gilgamesh to be the next one. Now, I have heard you, and I will be doing Gilgamesh at some point, not this year, but I know that he's very, very highly requested, and so I will obviously at some point deliver that content. But I thought that in the meantime, it would be good to start getting a little bit of those Gilgamesh wheels rolling on the channel and give you guys a little bit more insight into the text before we dive in together as a family. So, with all that being said, it means that my guest today is the perfect man for the job to open up this topic for all of us and kind of get those juices flowing. Today, I am chatting to Sophus Helle. Dr. Helle got his PhD in comparative literature in 2020, and since then has published two major translations. One is of Gilgamesh, the poem which we will be focusing on today. However, we will also be tapping into his second incredible translations of the poems of Enheduanna. But before we can dive into Gilgamesh, I would really love to start, Sophus, by asking you some context about yourself. So, how did you get started on this journey with Assyriology? How did you end up getting your PhD in comparative literature and really getting into, reading these ancient languages and these ancient texts? Where did that all start for you? And what was it that really drew you in to Assyriology?
Yeah, I think I started with a basic sense that I wanted to go as far back in history as possible. There was something like intriguing about that sense of discovery, of journeying, into the deep past. And I think when, I was an excitable teenager picking my major or whatever, like there was that sense of getting to know humanity as well as possible by going back in time as far as possible. I don't think I think one of the things you realize as a historian studying the ancient past is there's always an older past. You can always go further and further and further back. And so in a sense, it ended up being a little arbitrary that I, found Babylonian culture. But when I did find Babylonian culture and, sort of got stuck there on my journey into the deeper past, I really fell in love with it. And I continue to be in love with it. I think it's an amazing culture and rather set of cultures. And that they have so much to offer. I like to say that what I do as a historian is that I do historical dumpster diving. So I like to look for those gems of history that are overlooked, and then I like to show them to people and be excited about them. This see this amazing text or this amazing person or this amazing event. And I think Babylonian culture is a perfect field for that kind of instinct, because there is so much preserved material, in part because these cultures, the Babylonians and the Assyrians and the Sumerians, wrote on clay, and clay is this amazing writing material that is very durable. So much material survives, and so much of it is so interesting, but also so unknown. I also like to say that it really is true in the ancient world that a picture is worth 1,000 words. We all know ancient Egypt, in part because of these amazingly compelling pictures. And we have maybe about 1,000 times as much written material from the Cuneiform world, the world of ancient Iraq. But it is much less known, in part, I think, because it doesn't have that quite the same set of striking images as we know from Egypt. So that is ultimately what drew me to it, the richness of the material and the fact that there is so much left to discover and to find.
So we're here because you have two translations out that I want to dive into and introduce everybody to. So we'll start with Gilgamesh because that's the most well-known one of the two anyways. So take me back. I'm pretty sure you were 19 when you first read Gilgamesh.
Yeah, that's right. And I had like a series of encounters with Gilgamesh. I think I first read it in the translation by Andrew George, which is fantastic. And I had the distinct impression of like being underwater, like things were moving slowly, and things were fascinating. Like, I'm thinking of like that mermaid landscape in Harry Potter, the fourth Harry Potter film, like things are strange and you can hear what people are saying, but it's as if their words are coming at you like at this weird pace. The lips are moving, but it's hard to make sense of. And it was a fascinating landscape, but it was also like profoundly strange landscape. And then I read it for the first time in the original Akkadian, so one of the introductory books to the Akkadian language in which Gilgamesh is written by John Huehnergaard. And like it takes you up to be able to read Gilgamesh, like that's sort of the culminating exercise. And first time I'm reading in Akkadian, and it had this like dazzling intensity to it. Like rather than being underwater, it felt like everything was on fire. Like it crackles. I think one of the difficult things to convey about Gilgamesh in translation is the intensity of the language, the compactness of the poem. Like a line might be, 15 words in an English translation, it'll be 4 in Akkadian. So like it really is incredibly condensed in its poetic expression. And so reading it in the original really felt like, like an explosion.
So then, for people who don't know, like when looking at Gilgamesh from the ancient source material, what exactly are you dealing with? Because like they're used to me talking about Homer and Virgil and like books and things. So like, what are
Yeah.
you handling?
For sure. So Gilgamesh exists in a number of manuscripts. So it's not like Beowulf where there's only one manuscript. There's a whole number of manuscripts for Gilgamesh. And of Babylonian poetry, it is one of the 3 best preserved, or not best preserved, but like most attested poems, the poems with the most manuscripts to it. And so a lot of philological work implies examining these manuscripts and as I said, clay is a wonderfully durable material, but it's also very it has a tendency to break. So it's both somehow durable and fragmentary. And that means that we have a lot of manuscripts, but they're all they're all broken in one sense or another. And so piecing them together to create as complete a text as possible is a huge part of philological work. Another part that is also the case for other ancient texts is that these manuscripts will inevitably differ. They will write the same words in different ways. So it's also a question of like comparing the differences and reconciling them to produce a text that can sort of serve as a standard text. I don't work directly with the clay tablets when I'm working on Gilgamesh. I work on text editions. When I did my translation, I was primarily based on this amazingly magisterial text edition by Andrew George, the person I mentioned earlier. But what's really exciting right now is that there's a new digital text edition of Gilgamesh that just appeared earlier this year that really has revolutionized Gilgamesh studies. So like as of a few months ago, we're in a new era of Gilgamesh studies, and that's really, really exciting. Thanks to this new digital platform that has appeared, that has revolutionized our knowledge, not just of Gilgamesh, but also of a bunch of other Babylonian texts. So this is called the Electronic Babylonian Library, and it does a number of things that are really crucial for the study of Gilgamesh and for the study of Babylonian poetry in general. As I was saying, like a lot of these tablets are fragmentary, and some are like, postage stamp size. They're truly, truly tiny. And it can be really difficult for a human to be, okay, where in the vast corpus of Babylonian poetry do these like 4 signs belong? But that is the kind of thing that machine learning and, big digital databases, those kinds of problems they're really good at solving. And so they built in Munich, a project led by a guy called Enrique Jimenez, built this huge database and then developed a series of machine learning tools to go with it that allows us to place these tiny, tiny fragments. And that means that, some of the holes in Gilgamesh getting filled one tiny fragment at a time. And that's really exciting. But the database also does a bunch of other things, like it can allow you to track how a word is used in different texts much more swiftly, like it is the kind of work we could do before, but much more laboriously. Now you can just sort of click a button and see, oh, this word is used like this in this other text. Oh, it probably means this then, or rather it has this shade of meaning that I hadn't thought about. And so, yeah, it's just also super convenient.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah. And like, I think also, I mean, like, apart from this specific project, one of the things I really want to emphasize is that Gilgamesh is a changing text, is a developing text. So I've translated it first into Danish and then into English. And I did the Danish translation with my father, a Danish poet. And when we were doing the Danish translation together, a new bit of the text appeared, and we had to sort of go back and like change the translation we had made. And then between the Danish and the English translation, a new fragment appeared. So there's a bit in the English translation that isn't in the Danish. And then since the English translation, new bits have appeared, and so on and so forth. And I think that's one of the most amazing things about working on Gilgamesh, that it's a text that keeps changing and evolving as you study it, which, you know, can't be said about Homer. Homer is more or less fixed as a text, but this, it really is alive, and like it's still coming together, you know, 4,000 years after the earliest versions of Gilgamesh were composed.
Would you say that that was one of the most difficult things in dealing with the translation of something like Gilgamesh, is because it's always changing? You know, the text that you have that you're working with is going to be different to the one that somebody in 5 years or 10 years is then working with, like, or is there something else that's really difficult about the text that you knew going into it that you were like, okay, this is going to be the biggest problem, and how do you then overcome that?
Yeah, I don't know that I found that difficult as such. I think one of the ways I would explain this is, I think sometimes of the work of the translator is like an hourglass, because when you are translating a thing like Gilgamesh, especially, I think any text, but especially a text like Gilgamesh, you are faced with so much like multiplicity and variety. You know, like every word could be like every word has many connotations, and you sort of have to choose which of those connotations is most important. And a line is always doing many things at once. It might have a pun, and it might have like a clever point, and it might have importance for the plot. And you sort of have to choose, okay, which of these is most important to highlight. And that's the case for all translation. But for Gilgamesh, you like have layers of multiplicity, because as I said, like different manuscripts might render the same line in different ways. Or, you know, this is a text where the version I was translating is called a standard Babylonian version. That's the best known version. But we also have different versions of Gilgamesh that were composed over time. You know, so there are older versions that again might render the story a little differently, and so on and so forth. There are all of these sources of multiplicity, and add to that, you know, the thing we were talking about of like, you know, like so many things enrich this text or make its meaning, like the changeability of the text again adds to the sense of multiplicity. And so that's the sort of like the top half of the hourglass, where you as a translator, you know, you are narrowing all these different possibilities, all these different senses of variation and change and multiplicity, like through that tiny slit of the hourglass. And like that can feel like a loss, because there's so much in Gilgamesh that is not going to make it through that tiny slit. But then when you release a text into the world, one of the wonderful things about translating Gilgamesh is that I can get presented to people, including, you know, in interviews like this, and being there, like when I'm giving a lecture or whatever, being there when people encounter Gilgamesh for the first time is amazing, in part because people receive it so differently. You know, some people are out there saying like the cloaks of power that the monster Humbaba wears, they were comparing that to Harry Potter. Some people are like, oh, Gilgamesh feels like a musical to me. Or some people are like, this for me really reminds me of the time I lost my partner. Or, you know, some people are like, no, this for me, like, it reminds me of the struggle against climate change, or, you know, there's so many different things that I wouldn't necessarily have thought of myself. And that is, again, that's the bottom half of the hourglass. You know, that's that sense of enrichment. So a lot gets lost in translation, but also when you put a text like this out into the world, it really is an enriching experience, and it opens that so many senses of possibility and different readings and different interpretations. And that for me is one of the most, like, that's one of the reasons I work on Gilgamesh, because I love seeing how differently people react to it.
Absolutely. And you mentioned how you had written it originally with your dad. And I heard you in an interview say that when you went on tour for that version of Gilgamesh, that people were coming to you and asking you things like, you know, how does the text tackle grief, and how does the text tackle sorrow, or whatever, you know, any of the things that you've just listed as well. So I was wondering, from your perspective, like, why do you think that Gilgamesh still has that appeal, that people still come to it with those questions and they want to know what's going on in this and try and find those answers there?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I think like that question is the question of, you know, why does Gilgamesh matter to us today? And I think it's a relatively short text. You know, it's 110 pages in translation. So the fact that it manages to weave so many different themes and so many different topics, many of which still feel directly relevant to us, like again 3,000 years later, is really impressive. And I think that is the magic of the text. And when I was working on it, I was also working on its modern reception. And I think it is such a striking thing. Like there's a famous Austrian poet called Rainer Maria Rilke who said about Gilgamesh that, it concerns me. And I think that's the magic of the poem. So like that it feels like it still concerns us. And it concerns him individually. That's the power of that line. And for Rilke, Gilgamesh concerned him because it was about the longing for immortality and the fear of death, which is what he cared about. And for some people, Gilgamesh is a story of love between two men. For some, it's a story of loss. For some, again, it's a conflict between between culture and nature, including climate catastrophe, and so on and so forth. There's a wonderful essay by a classicist called Andrea Deagon, where she compares herself to Gilgamesh's Insomnia. The German Emperor Wilhelm II, when he abdicated, wrote an essay about Gilgamesh where he said, Gilgamesh represents imperial power. So, of course, and for Carl Jung, it was about incestuous desire. So really everybody can see something very different in Gilgamesh. It has that, kaleidoscopic quality to it. And I think there are many reasons for that. Some have to do with the text itself, with the way it's written, with the way it weaves all of these themes and topics together. But I also think it has to do with the text's unique position in our modern culture. I like to say that Gilgamesh is what I call a found foundation. So it's, foundational in the sense that it's this ancient text. And, people are always saying it's the first poem or the first epic. It's none of those things. But I think the fact that people say that reflects that we want it to be foundational. We want it to be the first something, because that gives this authority and this power. But at the same time, Gilgamesh is found. It just celebrated the 150th anniversary of its modern rediscovery. So again, unlike Homer, unlike these classics that have been read and interpreted for millennia, Gilgamesh has that sense of newness. And with that sense of newness comes a sense of strangeness, a sense of being unsettled. The American poet Michael Schmidt said about it that it has not had time to sink in. And I think there's something really true about that. We're still making up our minds about what Gilgamesh is about. And that is part of why it can generate so many different responses, because people they can still meet the text for themselves. They don't have to go through these layers of thousands of years of history of interpretation. They can have a more immediate encounter with it, and that means that they can see things in it that are directly relevant for them. So I think that's another reason why the text has that power.
Absolutely. Now, I'm super interested in the art of translation just because I'm not a translator. I can read ancient Greek and Latin, but I do it the disgusting literal way, where I always say to people, it's like the boat having been thrown. I can't do the flair and the pizzazz that you and other translators who have come on the channel do to these ancient languages. And something I always want to make clear to my audience is you do, as you were saying with that hourglass image, you have to really pick and choose the way that you translate things, because some things you just can't do in English. There are feels that you can't get across, or words that we don't have, things like that. And so when I was reading, because I don't know, ancient Sumerian or Akkadian or even Assyria really all that well, I've just started to dip my toe into it. I read a bunch of reviews of your Gilgamesh translation, all of them positive, before you get worried that I'm just going to start quoting all of these things to you. I'm absolutely not. But there was one thing that people kept pointing out that was different in your translation to other translations. And I really wanted to ask you why. It was with the character, I'm going to butcher this, Šamḥat?
Yeah.
Is that her name?
Yeah.
So you translated her and sort of her story a little bit differently to how it normally is. So I was wondering why you chose to make that translation and why you think that was better for her character in your version.
Yeah, so absolutely. So this is a huge controversial topic that, has to do with Babylonian culture, but also really spills into other aspects of the ancient world. And so the crux of the issue here is how to translate Šamḥat's title, which is Harimtu. And in my translation, I translate as priestess, and in many translations, you'll see some variants on the word sex worker for Šamḥat. And This is a controversial issue because, like, it relates to questions of, sacred prostitution. Was that a thing that even existed in the ancient world? Some, historians like Herodotus seem to imply that that did exist in Babylon, but we have no real solid evidence for that. And it's kind of like it ends up being a bit of a tautological question because our best evidence for what a harimtu is and does is Gilgamesh. But then you're sort of interpreting that, like, you can't really say, like, so many of the characters in Gilgamesh are exceptional. And so you can't really deduce, the Babylonians would have known what Harimtu was and did, but we don't know whether Šamḥat is typical or not. Either way, so just to explain why I translate the title as priestess, this might have been a sexualized role. I don't see any evidence of like straightforward sex work in the sources pertaining to Harimtus. But either way, the Harimtus, what we know about them is that they served as part of the temple of Ishtar and performed religious ritual duties, and like including in Gilgamesh, where they perform a lament for the bull of heaven when it is killed. And so, for me, a person working at a temple, participating in rituals, whatever else they might be, including however sexualized their role might or might not have been, that person's a priestess. You could be a priestess and other things, but for me, Harimtu is certainly a priestess associated with the temple of Ishtar and the worship of the goddess Ishtar. And so for me, that was a translation that felt safest. It is an ongoing question. And like, my colleagues go back and forth about this issue of the identity of the Harimtus in general and the possibility of ritualized sex work in general, but even also just the existence and scope and significance of sex work within Babylonian and Sumerian and Assyrian culture. And these questions are really like far from settled at the moment. One interpretation that I quite like, and this is by my former advisor, Nicole Brisch at the University of Copenhagen. And like, this is currently the interpretation I would be leaning towards, while acknowledging that this is an evolving discussion, is that in the middle of the second millennium BCE, so like give or take around year 1500, 1400, thereabouts, there's a huge shift in gender relations within the ancient world. And this is in itself like a topic that should be studied much more, where women are pushed out of spheres of power really across the board. Our best evidence of it is in the religious sphere, but it does seem to be a more general shift. So for example, the office of the high priestess, which was an immensely powerful and influential office, that's abolished. Goddesses are replaced with gods. Like the scribal goddess in the previous period, Nisaba, is replaced by a male god, just to give you one example. So really, women are demoted across the board. And it might be that the way that the Harimtu is reflected in Gilgamesh, or it's portrayed in Gilgamesh, reflects the gendered reality after this transition. And so part of the puzzle here is that in the epic, Enkidu, one of the main characters, gives first a blessing and then a curse upon this figure. So that seems to imply maybe an ambivalent social status in general, or it's just the ambivalence of this one character. Maybe not. And so it is possible, like there is other evidence to suggest that roles that were once, priestesses engaged primarily in rituals after the shift become more sexualized in one way or another, whether in reality or in the cultural memory is unclear. So yeah, there's a very, very caveated answer, but it's because it's a very difficult question at the moment. So I think my translation was more out of the sense of, I want to preserve the ambiguity of this role. Yeah, I think that's the best answer I can give right now.
That is so interesting, which is unfortunate that I don't know enough about this topic to really get into that, because the idea of that switch of power and all of that, guys, if I find anything else on it, I'll link it in the description below for you guys to check out. Or if you guys are listening on podcasting, it'll be in the show notes. But we should probably move on to talking about your other translation, which is the poems of Enheduanna. Am I butchering that as well?
No, that was great.
Amazing. First time for everything. So first and foremost, a lot of people are not going to know who that name is and who that person is. So who is this and why did you choose to translate her poems?
So yeah, again, like I was talking earlier about my instinct of historical dumpster diving. This is the best thing I found. It's not exactly like within the field in Hiduana is known, but certainly not outside the field. Like Gilgamesh might not exactly be a household name, but like people have heard of it in a way that people tend not to have heard of in Hiduana. And it's been definitely my mission for the past several years to bring in Hiduana to the fame that I really believe that she deserves. And so Enheduanna is the first known author in literary history. And so what that means is that her poems mark the first time that a literary text is attributed to a person we can identify in the historical record. And so that means, there are some questions, and we might get back to that, about the accuracy of these attributions, whether Enheduanna did indeed write the poems that were attributed to her. But either way, in this case, it really is the thought that counts. The very idea of authorship is born when these texts are attributed to this person. Earlier literary works are anonymous. They are attributed to a collective and nameless tradition. And so the very idea that there is a person writing a text begins with her. And not only that, but her best known work, which is The Exaltation of Inanna, depicts itself the moment of authorship. So, which is amazing again. Like it has this very like self-aware reflection on Enheduanna writing the text that we are reading. So all of this, I think, is great in itself. It's great that she's the first known author. It's great that the first known author is a woman. But besides that, I think these poems have just an amazing poetic power that is worth celebrating in itself. So 5 poems were attributed to Enheduanna. We're going to focus on 2 of those today. 2 of them are fragmentary, and one is not the one we're going to focus on. So the remaining 2, which are her best known works, The Exaltation of Inanna and The Hymn to Inanna, are both, as the title implies, a celebration of this particular goddess, Inanna. And Inanna is the Sumerian name of the goddess I mentioned earlier, Ishtar. So this is very much the world before this change in gender relations. Enheduanna is a high priestess, so she has that role that was later abolished. And Ishtar is depicted at the very best ambivalently, also very negatively in Gilgamesh. But here in Enheduanna, she is declared the queen of the cosmos. And so these are some of the most powerful celebrations of this goddess anywhere from the ancient world. If you read no other text of Sumerian poetry but Enheduanna's poems, you would come away with the impression that, the pantheon and thus the universe was ruled by Inanna. That is only the case, is only as forcefully the case in Enheduanna's poems. There are other texts that celebrate Inanna, but this is the most powerful celebration. And what is interesting about that is that Inanna is such a complex goddess. The sort of straightforward line about her is that she's the goddess of war and love, but that really sells her short. A, she is, if anything, much more the goddess of sex than of romantic love. But B, she is, and especially in Enheduanna's poetry, also just the goddess of change and contradiction and chaos. And by placing that kind of figure at the top of the pantheon, at the top of the cosmos, Enheduanna depicts a world that is ruled by change and that is ruled by contradiction and things turning into each other. And that is really a stunning vision of the world. So these poems are extremely powerful. They are also quite unlike Gilgamesh, because Gilgamesh is this fairly jaunty narrative poem about, 2 heroes out on an adventure, and then one of them dies, and then there's another adventure, and so on and so forth. And like it's relatively plot driven. Enheduanna is nothing like that. Her poems are, if Gilgamesh, I mentioned earlier that they're fairly condensed in their poetic language. Enheduanna is that times 3. Like every line has this thickness to it. And at one point she compares her literary speech to honey. And I really think that metaphor should be taken absolutely literally. The way that honey is delightful, and like her poems are delightful. But you wouldn't necessarily want to eat a bowl of honey because it has this like thick, viscous quality to it. And that is also the case for Enheduanna's poetry. Like her poems can feel like eating a bowl of honey just because of their intensity and their compactness.
I have so many questions after that. Okay, why don't we start with which is the best route to go with? No, okay, let's go with the translation route. So you mentioning how there's so much in these poems. Again, where I come from, I don't know what it's actually like when you're dealing with these ancient texts from, ancient Assyria and all of this. So thinking of poetry, I know that you inserted like new line breaks into this translation. What is it that's really specific to this poetry that you were kind of talking about that we just can't get and that is so difficult to translate? Is it like there's specific wording? Like, is there alliteration? Is there like, is she using words that can double as different meanings? Like, what is it in particular about this poetry that makes it so tricky and finicky to kind of get to as a translator?
So all of that, like definitely wordplay in various ways, alliteration, oral patterning, very intensely so, and definitely like words that can mean multiple things at once, entire lines that can be read one way or another, and so on and so forth. And again, the sense of compactness, like the lines are so short, which is why, as you said, I inserted new line breaks, in part to like highlight the compactness of the lines, in part to create a sense of flow, and in part also because in my translation of Enheduanna, I really leaned into trying to recreate some of this oral patterning, and the line breaks helped me do that. And so my translation of Gilgamesh, while I really wanted to highlight the things like alliteration and wordplay and so on in Gilgamesh, and that is something that I felt that the previous translations of Gilgamesh had not done that much. So it is something I was doing for Gilgamesh, highlighting the poetic patterning of the text. I still consider it a relatively faithful translation. Like, all things considered, like it does stick as close as I felt it was feasible while achieving this poetic effect as possible. Like, it is still a translation. With Enheduanna, that was more difficult. And so at times I deviated so much from the text in order to recreate these poetic effects that I felt, in part because I was presenting her to the world, and in part because, there's not 1,000 Enheduanna translations out there. There are some, but certainly not as many as there are for Gilgamesh. And so in order to sort of like balance this out, I created a website called enheduanna.org. And if you go to enheduanna.org/exaltation, you'll find a line-by-line breakdown of her best-known poem, The Exaltation, with the cuneiform, the transliteration, like a word-for-word translation, and then a very literal translation, and then a commentary pointing out difficulties in the line, but also things like wordplay or words that can mean opposite things and stuff like that. So that, I felt more free to do like my poetic translation in the book, and then people can use that website to like navigate the original Sumerian in more detail.
That sounds amazing. Oh my goodness, I'm going to check that out after this, even though I have no idea what I'm looking at, but still.
It is not made for people who are experts in Sumerian. It's made for people who want a sense of the Sumerian but don't have no familiarity with the language.
So then I was also really curious, because as you kind of touched on in your first answer, Gilgamesh, although not necessarily a household name, people know the name. Like it's one of those that like you'll say it and people will go, I don't know why I know that name, but I know that name.
Which is awesome. Like that's also an awesome place for the text to be at, because like that, it gives people a sense of intrigue, and then when they discover it, like Gilgamesh is so much more, I don't know, it's so much more fun, I think, than people who've just heard the name think it is.
Absolutely. But when it comes to Enheduanna, you mentioning that she's like the first like female poet, and she seems to be really interesting and important on paper. But as you said, like even though in your little corner of the nerd world she's known, outside we don't really know who she is. And so I was wondering, like, I mean, why, I guess, but is it because like I know that Gilgamesh was 150 years ago of its like rediscovery? Was Enheduanna before that? So was your industry more used to her, and so then they wanted to push Gilgamesh because they were like, oh my god, how exciting? Or did she come after that, and did she get dwarfed by Gilgamesh? Like, how come even though on paper she seems so important, she's not elevated to the level that you and I now think that she should be?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of different reasons. So she is later than Gilgamesh, like substantially later. And they like so the first English translation and the text edition of her poems appeared, I think, quite tellingly in 1968. Like when wherever in Hirwana goes, there's some sort of revolution going on. Like this tends to be the pattern. So of course, it was in the year of the student revolt that she appeared. Like anyway, so there are a couple of reasons. Number one, Sumerian as a language is just much less understood than Akkadian as a language. We have a like fairly good understanding of the Akkadian language. There's always more to learn, but like we know how the language functions. Like with Sumerian, basic things like the dictionary and the grammar are still under construction, still under negotiation. So there's just like it's just so much more challenging. And in Hirwana's poems are some of the most challenging Sumerian poems. She really strains and stretches this language in part because she's trying to express the power of this goddess who defines normal reason and normal thinking. So she really pushes this language that we already don't understand that well to, almost to a breaking point sometimes. So that is like, there's one reason that she is just much more challenging. The second reason is, as I mentioned, that there is this set of debates about the historicity of her authorship. So we know, unlike Homer, we know that Hirwana was a real historical person. She was the daughter of King Sargon, who founded the first known empire. He installs her as high priestess in the city of Ur. So, she's a real, and like she has a relief called the Disc of Hirwana, in which she is dedicating an altar to the goddess Inana. And we even have the name of her hairdresser and the steward of her estate from these like ancient cylinder seals. So we have the grave of her hairdresser. Like, it doesn't get much more historical person than that. We knew she existed. But the manuscripts of the poems are preserved from like 500 years after her death. And that is not inherently unusual for Sumerian poetry without going too much into the historical details. Like that's not that strange, but it does mean that we can't be exactly sure that the poems were not composed in those intervening 500 years and then attributed to her. And again, I don't want to go into the technicalities of that discussion right now. It just means that there is a question mark over her authorship. And again, I personally don't think that's that important because I think she's a fascinating literary figure. I think these amazing poems, whether they are about her as like the ancient equivalent of historical fiction or whether they were written by her. Like I think she's extremely important in the history of world literature because she marks the beginning of authorship. I think these poems are amazing. But I also know that my colleagues, when like it's something that held them back from, let's say, proselytizing in Hirwana, that there was this sense of doubt and this sense of debate about her. So I think that's another reason. And I also do think that like within like this is a field as aerology that is not exactly used to being celebrated, is not used to receiving a lot of popular interest. And so, you can sort of get used to people not being interested. And so when I was translating her, a lot of people were saying, oh, but people don't care about Hirwana. They might care about Gilgamesh, but they don't care about Hirwana. And that becomes a bit of like a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you are not used to there being interest in your field, you might not also realize that actually what it takes for people to be interested is, we've got to present this material in a new way. And again, Gilgamesh is amazing and Hirwana is amazing, but you should hear about the rest. Like there's always more, more to dumpster dive for in these ancient cultures.
I think you guys need to take a leaf out of classicist books because we are notorious for being some of the most dramatic bunch in the history field where we always think that our subject is going to die out. And so we're constantly screaming about things like, no, it's really important, I swear.
That is a very accurate. I think summary of classics.
I do it all the time. But something I'm really nosy about because I just don't get it and I don't want to sound like, stupid or anything, but I genuinely don't. For you as a translator, like you clearly love what you do. Like you keep going back into it. You've done 2 huge things already. And like, I have no doubt that your career is going to keep producing so many more amazing translations. But the language that you deal with, to me, looks like somebody got their fingernail and like stuck it into a tablet. So what is the interest for you as a translator and moving forward of looking at like chicken scroll and being like, oh, there's a word here. How fun. I bet I can read it.
Yeah, it's funny because like both of the metaphors you just used are actually used by the Babylonians themselves. So like if if you're signing a contract and you're illiterate, you would use your fingernail, and like the fingernail is a sign that is often used like as a signature, as a proof of identity in clay, because it does, like many of these look like fingernails. And the other thing is there's this like spoof contract, like a mock contract, in which this like a genie or like a demon-like creature that has the head of a bird buys property near the gate of hell. And so like the signature, it looks like little, bird, like what was it, like chicken prints. So like they are aware of how this looks, and they're able to play with it, which is great. Like I love, that's why I love the Babylonians. I often love their sense of humor. I think they're great. I think they're very, comfortable making fun of themselves. What was the question? Oh yeah, like I do think that Cuneiform is a wonderful script. First of all, before like I answer the question more generally, I think it's an amazing writing system. And while it can appear very dull, again, we were talking about earlier the comparison to the ancient Egyptians, and hieroglyphs are so pretty and so nice to look at. And that's not necessarily true of Cuneiform at first glance, but I think what's wonderful about the script visually is that it's so three-dimensional. This is not, something that is created by inking, hieroglyphs onto papyrus, or, printing ink onto paper, but it is something that is made by putting a stylus into clay. And so that means that you read it by turning it against the light. And when you turn it the wrong way, it's just mishmash. But when you turn it the right way, it sort of comes alive suddenly. And like it's all of these tiny reliefs and like this play of light and shadow that's so beautiful. But you sort of have to know how to turn the tablet in order to make it come alive, which I think again is wonderful. And something that's also really important for Gilgamesh, because Gilgamesh ends up claiming that he will achieve, eternal life through our reading of the text. And so it's very literally the way we bring it to life, by looking at it, by holding the clay tablet and voicing it, that gives Gilgamesh the life that he ultimately looks for. So that's my defense of cuneiform in particular. It's an amazing writing system also in the way that it allows for so much play with multiple meanings and all of that. I think that's, it's an incredibly rich writing system. But more generally, that sense of fascination, yeah, I mean, like, I definitely think part of the magic of working with ancient cultures is that sense of discovery, of reading texts that haven't been read for thousands of years. Assyriology is a philological discipline, and people these days, like speaking of the classics time, people barely know what philology is. But I think part of the way I understand philology, and I've written about this elsewhere, the way I understand philology is that you are dealing with what I call crisis of reading, when a text for whatever reason has become difficult to read, either because its language has died out, or because again the text is written on, the manuscript is written on, is fragmentary, or different manuscripts give different versions of the text, or the text is alluding to something that is not quite clear what it is, like the harimtus, like the text is encrusted by these crises. And philology is about staying with those crises and like thinking with the crisis, sometimes resolving them and making the text readable in the form of an edition or a translation, and sometimes just appreciating the text as, having these problems to it that create this uncertainty. And so I definitely think there is a philological way of reading text that differs a little bit from other ways of reading literature, where you assume that you know what the text says, like, right? Like, you can at least, like, you might ponder the complexities of the text in literary studies, but you sort of assume that you know what the letters are, which is not necessarily the case for cuneiform. And I do think that there is something about a philological engagement with the text. And like, I'm not in the deep end of philology. I don't work with the manuscripts themselves, I'm often reliant on text editions and so on and so forth. But I do still partake of that fascination with the way that philological, like texts that require philological engagement, produce these ambivalences and these moments of undecidability, or these moments of mystery also. So I do think that like part of my interest in Gilgamesh and in Inana comes from that instinct.
So then what's next for you? Like, are you going to be doing another translation, or are you going to be focusing more so on like a particular niche research? Like, what can people expect to see from you, you know, if they follow you on Twitter or whatever we're calling it now? I'm calling it Twitter, but Twitter or social media, what's next?
Yeah, so I'm on both Twitter and Instagram at Sophus Helle. So I have a number of projects. I think the one that's most relevant for this context is that I'll be launching with some colleagues, including Enrique Jimenez, whom I mentioned earlier, Johannes Haubold, and Selena Wisnam. We're launching a new book series called The Library of Babylonian Literature, which will present the main classics of Babylonian literature in facing page translation. So I'm making the translations for that. These are not poetic translations like I did for Gilgamesh and Inana. They're more like study translations to help people like get into the text. And each translation will be accompanied by an introduction, again by me, and by a series of essays by leading scholars that sort of open up various topics. So the first volume is on the Babylonian epic of creation, Enuma Elish. And so we have essays on gender in Enuma Elish, or, you know, Enuma Elish and astronomy, Enuma Elish and the power of speech, or whatever it might be. And so the idea is for this to help either researchers from adjacent fields like classics, or history of religion, or just students who want to get into this text, but, you know, for very good reasons, don't know where to start because it's Babylonian literature and nobody's ever heard of anything. So, you know, these texts are meant to, or these books are meant to open up the texts. So as I said, we're starting with the Babylonian epic of creation, Enuma Elish, and that should be out within this year with Bloomsbury.
Oh, amazing. So that's kind of then the last question that I always ask. So I like to end all of my interviews with like a piece of advice. And it was going to be, where can people turn? But we've already done that because I will link all of that in the description below for you guys. So I guess changing the piece of advice that we could leave people with. I think like when it comes to Assyria, and like I can certainly speak from this, like it's quite a daunting field to look at from the outside in. Like as somebody who's comfortable with like Homeric Greek, I look at Assyria and I'm like, nope, no, I don't know what's going on there or what the language is. It's quite nerve-wracking. So I would say if there's somebody else who is like me in this case and is like, that's really interesting, but I don't really know like what that first little step is. Do you have kind of like any advice for them? Not necessarily what the first step is, but just sort of like any words of comfort or encouragement or something that you can give them to like go off and to help and to start reading?
Yeah, I mean, like I definitely find these cultures enormously rewarding. I feel like if you put in the effort of learning the basics, like you will be rewarded with so many nuggets of knowledge and so many amazing fun stories. And again, a lot of that has to do with a specific material quality of clay. With, you know, the Homeric epics and the classical world more generally, we are reliant on these, you know, monks and other scribes in the medieval period who preserved these poems for us, but also filtered a bunch. And like we can talk about the literature that got lost in the medieval transmission, but also just a bunch of like laundry bills got lost because they weren't worth copying. And a lot of those laundry bills survived in clay because we're not reliant on the manuscript transmission. Like we, you know, there is somebody at one point wrote down a letter to their mother, and that mother read the text and then threw it away, and then that clay tablet survived 4,000 years. And so I think there's a lot of like flashes of everyday life, flashes of personality that the cuneiform record is uniquely good at preserving. Like that letter that I was talking about, like it's not made up. There's a student writing that, you know, everybody else at school has better clothes than them, and that their mother is too stingy to pay for the latest clothes. And like that's, you know, that's a wonderful little thing. Like there's another, like I love this model letter that a student was copying out, and then they got bored, turned it around, and then drew a goat. Like, you know, there are all of these moments of magic, moments of personality, moments of humanity that I do think make these cultures very rewarding. A lot of what makes it rewarding is, you know, of course, they have these amazing philosophical reflections on the world, these amazing passages of poetic power, but there's also just a lot of like everyday life in these resources. And I think a lot of my colleagues who work on bringing these texts to a wider audience and bringing these cultures to a wider audience are really focusing on that these days, are really realizing that. So for example, Amanda Padani's new book, Weavers, Scribes and Kings, is a great example of somebody who focuses on these like stories, these, you know, flashes of personhood from across the ancient Near East in bringing this to life. So I think that's my main like words of encouragement. Another would be that these cultures are just so rich, so there is sort of something for everybody. If you care about, if statecraft and the way societies are put together, the ways we organize community is what you care about, then there are texts like Hammurabi's Law, which is an incredibly interesting text for thinking about how the state is built and how laws work. Hint very differently from what we think of as law today. If you care about the history of religion, there are so many interesting religious figures like Ishtar or Inanna. If you care about the history of gender, again, there's this huge gender change in the very middle of cuneiform culture that we have just scratched the surface of as scholars. So I think that sense of richness, but also just how much is left to discover, how much is left to know, how much is left to find. I think those are other aspects of these cultures that make them really rewarding to engage with.
Well, that seems like a great place then to end the conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Helle, for joining me today and for chatting about all things Gilgamesh and translation and ancient Assyria. I learned so much, so I really, really appreciate the time you took out of your day to do this. And of course, thank you to all of you guys at home for sitting down, for watching, for engaging with the channel, commenting, all of that stuff. It means the world that you guys continue to be excited about the content that I produce. Now, of course, as we've said throughout this whole video, you guys can find all of the links that you will need in the description below. In case you guys are listening on podcasting platforms, you can find that in the show notes. So links to not only Dr. Helle's, social media and website and everything that we had mentioned, but also the translations of Gilgamesh and the poems of Enheduanna and everything else that we have spoken about. It's always made as easy as possible for you guys to find via the description or show notes, whatever platform you're listening on. So thank you guys so much, and I'll be seeing you next time with more content here on Moan Inc. I'll see you guys then.